Is this a good position for this for you? Yeah. I didn't check. Sure. No. This position. Is it okay? Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, I'll move it. Well, hello everybody. It's my special honor and privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Erik Rotterman, born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he attended college, Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Graduated summa cum laude in physics, biochemistry, with a minor in molecular biology. Having a physics background myself, I appreciate that. So he went to medical school at University of Toledo, and from there has moved on to join our illustrious program. One of the great things about working with Erik is his wonderful sense of humor, and just in putting together some materials here for me to introduce him with, he tells me he enjoys long walks on the beach. But of course, in relation to today's topic, he also has a great interest in the horror genre, understanding what the meanings of horror stories are and all that, which is what we're going to learn about today. Very interesting stuff. So join me in welcoming Dr. Erik Rotterman.
Right. Well, welcome. Thanks for the introduction, Dr. Goodwin. I'm here to do my grand rounds. Obviously, my name is Erik Rotterman. I'm a fourth-year resident. I think that's all been explained already. So let me start here with the slideshow. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about today, can everyone hear me okay? Pretty good. What? Closer? A little louder? Okay. So I'm going to be talking today, the topic is fairy tales, fear, and the horror genre. So the objectives today are to recognize the cultural and psychological value of fairy tales, and in more detail, the horror genre. Recognize fear as an affect, a neurobiological state, as a behavioral tool, and as a topic for cerebral discussions. Recognize how fear, appropriate or not, is omnipresent in our everyday lives and why it may come to the counseling room. This is the table of contents here. First, I'm going to ask the question, why tell stories? Was there a benefit to it? We're going to look briefly into fairy tales as an example. Then I'm going to give you some quick definitions of fear and horror. I'm going to look at the ways that fear has been studied. Then I'm going to ask the question, why would people tell scary stories? That sounds terrible. We'll look at who watches them. Then we're going to look at a couple horror movies, two of my favorites. And then we're going to look briefly at fear in our culture. So first, why do people tell stories? Here we have a quote from the great Carl Jung, listing out a bunch of, different critters that we've added to our stories, poltergeists, ghouls, jinns, muses, spirits, etc. Why do we spend so much time talking about these things? And that's, like I said, it's from Carl Jung. Just kidding, it's from Dr. Erik Goodwin. Thanks again for the introduction. In fairy tales, there's just a few general rules that we can go over. I think there's probably a lot more than this, but for one, nothing is as it seems generally. Appearances are deceptive in fairy tales. If there is a rule, the protagonist will often break it. Example is don't go into the West Wing in Beauty and the Beast. And fairy tales seem to function to probe and explore the boundaries of life. Well, so what? Well, fairy tales exist as basic story structures that both occur and co-occur in parallel in multiple cultures. They often focus on symbols of the unconscious, such as a dark forest, an ocean, the darker forbidden room, and also we'll see in one of the movies I talk about perhaps space as well. They often are didactic, teaching a lesson on integration of the self or on the borders of the self within society. And how does this have to do with horror, right? How am I going to connect this? So fairy tales often involve characters that represent the shadow archetype, and the protagonists in these fairy tales will be forced to either confront, work with, assimilate, or in some way reckon with this shadow archetype. And this is a quote from Marie-Louise von Franz, a Swiss Jungian psychologist, and she says, "In regard to fairy tales, evil incitements provide us with the opportunities to increase consciousness. It seems that nature takes this view and represents it in this way. When we are able to see our own greed, jealousy, spite, hatred, and so on, then these can be turned to positive account, because in such destructive emotions is stored much life. And when we have this energy at our disposal, it can be turned to positive ends." So that's all I'm going to talk about with fairy tales today. Now I'm going to give you some definitions of fear and horror. So fear, this is just standard dictionary definition. An unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. It could also be an anxious concern. We also have here the profound reverence, referring to a fear of God or God-fearing people, and I think we could do an entire lecture on the origin of that. So what is horror then? Well, here we have a quote from H.G. Wells, who wrote The War of the Worlds, describing horror: "A painful and intense fear, dread or dismay, astonishment, giving place to horror on the faces of the people about me." And it's also described as an intense aversion or repugnance. So again, it doesn't sound great. Now I'm going to go over just kind of a brief survey of fear and science and philosophy. I can look this way too. So neuroanatomically, we often hear about the limbic system. This was first coined by Paul MacLean. It was based off the work of James Pepys, the Pepys circuit. It is called limbic because it comes from the Latin word limbus, and it's the structural rim of the cortex, medial wall of the cortex. And it's often called the paleomammalian brain, which contrasts with the reptilian brain consisting of the basal ganglia and brainstem. This is a fairly limited theory because it creates a sort of false dichotomy between the emotion and the cognitive experience of the emotion. And it's also limited because analogous structures of the paleomammalian brain have been found, and the mammalian neocortex have been found in both birds and reptiles. So this is the Pepys circuit. One of the major things about this is it has a hippocampus in it, and when we compare it to the limbic system, which again was based on this, the limbic system adds the amygdala, probably correctly, and does away with the hippocampus. But I think both of these, views are somewhat limited in scope. They don't really take the whole picture into account. And even when we try to take the whole picture into account with a schematic, it can end up looking something like this, which is too much for me to go into today. But you notice this is probably the most up-to-date, fear stimulus output schematic, and it has both the amygdala and the hippocampus. So it's combining aspects of both of those and adding more. So we can also take the teleological view of emotions, where you're asking about the purpose rather than just the cause. And in this case, some people actually posit that emotions as an affect come from the more deeply rooted structures, the subcortical midline structures, which has some overlap with the limbic system. And that as you develop more layers of brain evolutionarily on top of that, you get to a point where it's actually an emotion as we understand it. So just kind of trying to throw some stuff out there since we are a psychiatry department before I get back to the stories and stuff. Also, fear as an affective state. In 1878, French anthropologists called emotions passions of short duration and intimately linked with organic life, and described them as abnormal excitation of the nervous network that induce changes with the normal relationship between the peripheral nervous system and the brain. So in 1878, this guy was pretty on top of things. So of course we all know about fight or flight. We also know animals that freeze, and so when an animal is scared, it's going to exhibit one of these three responses generally. With fight or flight, you have an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure, and this tends to occur when the animal sees an escape route that is clear. Freezing often occurs when there's an indeterminate escape route, and it results in a decreased heart rate, decreased blood pressure, and it's sort of like a wait and see. This has been studied within a lot of different animals, including humans, and one interesting thing is that even within a specific species that tends to exhibit a certain pattern, there's still variation, and this is referred to as protean behavior. It's named after the Greek god Proteus of the sea, who could change its shape, and this probably helps with the species' survival to be somewhat unpredictable. So fear in behavior. Fear is a motivation in itself. Animal studies have found that deprivation, noxious stimuli, frustration, and conflict all push toward behavior. We can pair neutral stimuli with a noxious stimuli and then take away the bad stimuli and still get behavior that was trained with the bad stimuli, noxious stimuli. And it's also been found that activators, which in this case would be fear, energize any response and can be directed toward learning. So it may not even be a response that relates to the stimuli. There's been some rat experiments that this is some of the early work in this, that sort of helped to point in this direction. First, with rats in a maze, and a certain set of them were given a shock, and a certain set of them were not, and they got food as a reward. It was found that the rats that were shocked kept completing the maze successfully for food, even after they were no longer hungry. Also, the study found that rats, after they were shocked, will drink more water than rats not shocked. So again, this shows that any sort of noxious stimuli can increase a behavior, sometime indiscriminately. So this is my last slide on behaviors, I promise. And this just sort of describes one experiment where they took rats and they put them in a white box and they shocked them. And there was a black box adjacent to it with the door closed. When they opened the door, all of the shocked rats would run immediately into the black box. What they found was, in several different stages, that even when you remove the shock, the rats are still motivated to get away from the white room into the black room. And that when they added mechanisms that the rats actually had to figure out, instead of the experimenter opening the door, the rats would figure this out. In the end, 13 of the 25 rats studied ended up learning 2 different mechanisms to open the door. And here I call them traumatized rats because I think they were motivated by their trauma. So we're going to take a quick detour into philosophy, a sort of cerebral look at fear. And this is Professor Shelley Kagan. He is a philosophy professor at Yale, and he does a whole lecture series on emotions. And he defined the appropriateness conditions for fear in his mind. Again, very cerebral. What are the conditions that have to be met for us to say that a fear that someone has is appropriate? So 1, it has to be a bad thing. Makes sense. 2, there has to be a non-negligible chance that that bad thing is going to happen. So it can't be that there's no way this thing will happen, because then why would you be afraid of it? And 3, there has to be uncertainty, because if you know when it's going to happen, perhaps you shouldn't be fearing it. His lectures on fear specifically deal with death, and so I think these criteria fit whether or not having a fear of death is appropriate. And I really included him in this lecture because watching his lecture, they're great, they're free online, you should check them out, is the way that he talks is a lot like Dr. Al-Malik, if everyone's had a chance to work with him here. So you can let me know if you agree with me on that after this.
Condition number 2 is there's got to be a non-negligible chance of the bad state of affairs happening, of the bad object coming to you. It's not enough that it's a logical possibility for fear to be a reasonable reaction. Look, there's nothing logically inconsistent or logically incoherent about the possibility that I will face my death by being ripped to pieces by Siberian tigers. It's not as though that's an inconsistent state of affairs. It's certainly logically possible, but it's so unlikely, it's so negligibly small a chance that if anybody here is afraid that they'll be ripped to pieces by tigers, then I can only say the fear doesn't make any sense. It's not appropriate. Again, we can tell special stories where that might be different. Do you suppose you tell me that, when you're not a student or your work-study program, what you do is you work as an animal trainer, or you're planning to work in the circus.
So I'm just going to cut that a little short, but on the topic of telling special stories where we can create a non-negligible chance that something bad might happen, I asked the question, why would we do that? And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed that video. Here's the question. Fear is a noxious stimuli, right? I mean, I went through all those behavioral slides to sort of imply that. How can this be? And could there be a benefit to it? Well, let's check. Here's a quote from John Carpenter. He's one of the masters of horror. He's famous for Halloween, The Thing, They Live. Also Big Trouble in Little China. You seen that? Genres always change. Horror has been with cinema since the very beginning, and every generation makes it with their own sensibilities and fears. It will always be with us because every human being is scared. We were all born afraid. We're afraid of our own death. Every fear you have, I have. It's universal. Humor isn't always universal. Fear is. That's why horror is so incredible. So, interesting quote. I appreciated it. Who watches this stuff? It may not surprise you that males tend to like horror movies more than females. There's not a lot of great data on there, and some of it actually points the other direction. But I think the majority tends to say that males like this more. One study, was a survey out of UPenn, used a Likert scale, and this was for people who, it was a sample of people that may or may not like horror at all. So on that scale, males rated 3.5, females 3.29, so really not a huge difference. Another interesting thing is this study found that there's an increase in sensation seeking on the brief sensation seeking scale. Again, that may not be too surprising. And they also found, interestingly, an elevation on the openness to experience on the Big Five personality. And openness to experience includes traits of insightfulness, imagination, and having a wide variety of interests. All right, way to go, man. So another thing that was interesting is people who enjoy horror expect to experience a wider array of positive emotions, even if they are expecting to feel the same amount of fear. So if someone doesn't like a horror movie and they expect to be scared, they don't expect to feel happiness, joy, and a whole set of positive emotions that they tested for. But if someone enjoys the genre, they still expect to feel fear. They still expect to feel some of these negative emotions, but they also expect to feel some positive ones as well. So just some interesting stuff about the demographics. So there's some theories as to why people may enjoy the horror genre. I'm just going to go through them. So these are the three we're going to talk about. First is excitation transfer theory. It's developed by Dolph Zillman, formerly of the University of Alabama. And according to this theory, essentially how much bad you feel how much uncomfortableness you feel gets turned into a positive feeling at the successful resolution of the story. So I call it sort of a sort of affective transmutation. This theory has its limitations. For one, a lot of horror movies don't end very pleasantly. And so there's been sort of an addendum to this theory that maybe people are just so relieved when the movie is over that they feel good. This theory is still, I think, used in communications. But I think, like I said, it has its limitations with the horror genre. I think when it was applied by people that don't tend to appreciate the genre. The next theory is benign masochism, pioneered by Paul Rosen, professor of psychology at UPenn. And this is a process where initially aversive activities become pleasurable. There's a quote from Steven Pinker describing benign masochism. These paradoxical pleasures include consuming hot chili peppers, strong cheese, and dry wine, and partaking in extreme experiences like saunas, skydiving, car racing, and rock climbing. Skipping ahead. The ultimate advantage is to open up beneficial regions in the space of local experiences that are closed off by default by innate fears and cautions. So this sort of ties in with the openness to experience thing, the imagination, and it also ties into the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the theory of abjection. With benign masochism, the idea is that one is exposing themselves to potentially noxious stimuli and mastering it to get a sense of self-efficacy. So the theory of the abject, abjectus is a Latin word meaning to cast off. Regarding horror, the idea of abjection was popularized by psychoanalyst and philosopher Julia Kristeva. And she would say, abjection is that which does not respect borders, positions, rules, and which disturbs identity, system, and order. So in this way, the abject can refer to the border of social order or the border of different types of order. So in a legal context, any crime is abject. In a religious context, something unthinkable like a body without a soul is abject, and that's why you have things like vampires and zombies. And I guess in the olden days, in this theory, rituals would serve as society's means to renew contact with the abject and then to expel it, to sort of meet it, say, yep, we don't want that in our society, get out of here. So the abject also relates to the border of oneself as in self-other or self-object. The concept of a border is essential to the construct of a monster. That which threatens the subject from the outside is therefore abject. So in this way, horror serves often to bring about an encounter between the symbolic order and that which threatens its stability. And so the question is watching a horror movie a modern ritual to cast off the abject? Now we're going to talk about some horror movies. Two of my favorites. One of them is Alien. It's 40 years old this month. So I thought it was appropriate. The other one is The Babadook, which is probably my favorite. So before we get into the movie of Alien, here's the title screen. We're going to talk about the art that made it fairly notorious. And that is the art of H.R. Giger. You can see a piece by him here. His art is often called biomechanical. And he was born in Switzerland during World War II. And he also came of age during the Cold War. And in his art, you see the meeting place of biology and technology. And considering how he came of age with the threat of very destructive technology looming, there's often sort of a morbid nature to this. His artwork is also very sexual. So it really begs the question of biology versus technology. This is one of his famous pieces, the Necronomicon 4. Spooky name. And this looks a lot like the Alien monster, if you've seen Alien or any of those movies. And it's probably what it was based on. You can sort of see Again, you can sort of see like a phallus in the back of this alien's head. So there's always some kind of sexual, biological, and mechanical trope in his art. So I'm going to give you a brief plot synopsis of Alien, and there's spoilers, so sorry. Crew of 7 aboard commercial mining spaceship the Nostromo with their computer named Mother awaken from hypersleep far from their destination of Earth. The crew is tasked by Mother to investigate a beacon on an unknown planet. Members of the crew land and investigate the beacon in a crashed alien craft, only for one of the crew members to be attacked and impregnated by an unknown creature. Against the containment protocol, but as advocated for by the chief science officer, very typical, the crew returns to the ship. A baby alien erupts from the body of a crew member, and horror ensues. Everybody dies, except for Ripley, played by Sigourney Weaver. So, I'm going to give you some pictures for this. This is when the crew wakes up from the hypersleep aboard Mother. This is one of the first of many maternal and sort of birth images in the movie. And here you see a sort of sterile, non-traumatic birth. This is the captain of the ship talking with the computer. That's the acronym Mother. I don't know what it stands for. And there's a life support system has a female voice, but they also type to it in a very glorious 80s fashion. And they say, why are we going to this beacon? And Mother says, does not compute. And I get the impression Mother's usually pretty straightforward with them. This is when they go down to investigate the beacon. 3 of the crew members have to go into this alien craft. And you can see they're about to go into this craft where the beacon is. And it's kind of like they're about to walk into a birth canal, into a womb. When they get in, one of them discovers this egg chamber. One of the eggs pops open and attacks him and gets on his face and impregnates him through his mouth. And this is when they brought him back on the ship. That's the face hugger there on his face, and they're trying to figure out, what are we going to do? That's the science officer who turns out to be working for Mother, but we'll get to that in a second. And he's who had them break the containment protocol. But they didn't have to worry too long because the thing just falls off and dies. And then this guy is up laughing, and they're just so relieved he's okay, and they're eating and joking around, talking about how the food is terrible in space. And which I think is kind of silly because that's definitely granola right there. Then this happens. After a few bad bites, he gives birth, and this alien creature erupts from him. This is a much more traumatic birth scene. Also, I just want to note, I think that's mango and chocolate, so they're eating pretty well in space. This is what the alien looks like up close, and it's hard to tell, but it looks very much like that H.R. Geiger piece. They actually used a real human skull in the construction of it, a little factoid. And here's a few more shots of the alien, just pretty terrifying at the time. The alien systematically kills everyone, except for Sigourney Weaver. She survives with her cat here that she goes on to rescue from harm, which is significant, and I'll try to explain why here. So some conclusions, or to try and explain. So Alien, much like H.R. Geiger's art, looks at humanity's existence in the realm between biology and technology. It does so by utilizing the monstrous feminine motif in 2 opposing ways. You have the alien, which represents a sort of generative, archaic mother that is just gonna, it's basically just raw biology. It's just gonna keep growing and reproducing at the expense of anything. And then you have the ship, which is just like a technological, sterile vessel. It takes care of the basic needs, but it doesn't really care for its own crew, its own kids in the end. And the way you know this is because it turns out that Mother had an agenda of bringing this alien on board and bringing it back to study. So you have essentially, and the orders were, at the expense of whatever crew it takes. So you have this sort of greater good, don't care about your offspring, care about the whole of the technologically advanced society, versus this just sort of pushing for like constantly generating offspring Mother. But it leaves the viewer with a sense of relief, with Ripley, Sigourney Weaver's character, surviving, and sort of symbolizing a way to maintain life, a happy life in the current symbolic order, the current in-between of biology and technology. She goes and rescues her cat, which is, in this sense, kind of symbolizes her caring for her child, but also not being a murderous alien. So she is safely in between those two things. Of note, Ridley Scott, the director, actually had a different ending in mind. He wanted to have the alien ultimately, there's sort of like a false happy ending, and then the alien would kill Ripley and get into the sort of captain's chair, contact other humans and speak with a human voice and say, we survived, I'm coming back, and go back and continue on. So it seems like Ridley Scott actually was trying to say that ultimately life will survive and outlive technology. Seems like 20th Century Fox wanted us to feel very comfortable. Well, now we're going to talk about The Babadook, which, like I said, is one of my favorites. It's a modern fairy tale about the fracturing of the psyche that occurs in trauma. So The Babadook, and there's spoilers here too, sorry I didn't warn you, tells the story of a mother dealing with trauma and grief. Her husband died while driving her and their unborn son to the hospital for delivery. It was a pretty traumatic car crash. The story takes place around the time of her son's 4th birthday. And in The Babadook shows up and communicates with her and her son through storybooks initially, little children's books. They're kind of scary, and they kind of tell us what's going on. So I've got a couple clips here.
Really clever one can make friends with a special one, friend of you and me. Name is Mr. Bub. Rumbling sound, sharp knock. That's when you're
Babadook. But you said I could choose.
see him in your room at night.
Mom, does it hurt the boy? Mom, does it live under the bed? Mommy!
the loveliness that lay at the bottom of the ocean, and entreating the sailors not to...
So you can see in this storybook, the Babadook is represented by a shadow. And you'll find out as you watch the movie that it symbolizes a shadow archetype. And that's how the Babadook introduces himself to them. This next clip elaborates a little bit more, and hopefully no one is too easily scared in here. Also, I want to add she destroys the book right away, right after she reads that. So this is about 25 minutes later in the movie. You get that duck, duck, duck on the door. And she's opened it. Oh, restarted. So here you see the Babadook telling her that basically the more you repress her feelings that come from the sort of fractured psyche that was created when the trauma occurred, the stronger those feelings get. And the Babadook is noted as a shadow and is a shadow figure throughout the movie. And essentially, she's in denial of the anger she feels. She's in denial of how this affected her because she's had to raise this kid for 4 years. And she's also in denial of how angry she is at her kid, whether or not that's irrational, because she blames, because she was pregnant with him when the car accident happened, she blames the kid for the loss of her husband, her son. I keep saying the kid. He's kind of annoying in the movie, so you don't want to. So resolution of the story in the Babadook comes not from merely getting over it, but rather from the mother accepting and integrating the grief as her own. Eventually, in the end, and it's kind of weird, she allows the Babadook to exist in her after standing up to it, sort of becoming one with her own anger. She puts the Babadook in the basement of the house, and she continues to feed it. She gives it worms, but it's sort of giving it its acknowledgement that, yeah, I do have these feelings. They are a part of me. I can't keep them out because if I do try to do that, they will come and sort of take over me when you least expect it. Also, spoiler, the dog does actually die. It's really sad. Go watch this movie. So when you take the movie as a fairy tale, it suggests that if one does not integrate their grief, you'll be haunted by a Babadook. Like this, when I first saw it, I thought, oh my gosh, this is so clever, because the Babadook is now sort of a personification of the grief that comes from trauma or loss, and how you can be haunted by it if you don't successfully integrate it into your sense of yourself. And it serves as a reminder of the destructive power of unresolved, repressed grief and trauma. So that's me talking about the movies. Now I'm going to briefly talk about fear and horror in our culture. And I'm going to try to wrap it up and tie all this together. We'll see. So fear in our culture, the news makes us fearful. I mean, how many of you, probably not a lot of the medical students or residents, but watch cable news or the nightly news? It's terrifying. And there's actually a lot of evidence, and there has been for some time, that this makes us more fearful. So what does that do to us? How is that activating our behavioral, going back to the behavioral section, what is that causing us to do? Most data shows that middle-aged white women are the most susceptible, and that's because a lot of the victims, and especially the nightly news, are middle-aged white women. So they are able to substitute themselves into that position. Another theory, I kind of skipped over this, is if the news resonates with you, if you've experienced something similar or you feel like you could, then that's why it might make you fearful. There's a few other different theories. But there's the quote, "If it bleeds, it leads." I'm not even sure who said that first. But it's sort of just an aphorism at this point. Fear affects our behavior. So this is some old data, but this is at a point when people were really studying it. After 9/11, about 1,000 more people died on the road in the 3 months following it. So I guess October to December, than would have been expected because they were afraid to fly. And driving is actually far more dangerous. There was also a 33% in gun sales on the weekend of July 4th, 2002, because there was a lot of news reports saying, watch out, there's going to be a terrorist attack. Wow. No, thanks. That's helpful because, you get to feel good when you're buying something. And then that's dangerous too because I think you've seen Zoolander. You know what happens with a gasoline fight. But exactly, people were driven by their fear to do things. They panicked. So horror and culture now. This, it's going to be on the screen for a second. I'm sorry. This is it's actually an art piece called Mother Bird by Kaisuke Iso, a Japanese artist. And it led to something called the Momo Challenge, where someone, I guess, took a picture of this, and this is recent, in the last few months, and tweeted, like, this entity is going to contact your children and tell them to commit suicide. And it got many, many retweets, and then it was picked up by nightly news and covered across the country. And ultimately, it was found out to be a hoax. Surprise. But the artist didn't do that. Some random person found this, and so this is an example of a moral panic, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But what's interesting about this story is that this mother bird is based on a Japanese folktale of the Abumi. And the Abumi is the spirit of a woman who lost her child and I think also died during childbirth. And so in Japan, these Abumis stalk the land, and when they find people like a mother with their new child, they'll ask to hold the baby. And when they return the baby, the actual mother will find that the baby has been turned into a heavy stone, and they've lost their baby because the Abumi stole it. And so it's interesting, and maybe the person that started tweeting this was aware of this backstory, but it's kind of odd how such a similar story, went viral, that this thing's going to tell your kids to commit suicide. Another example is Slender Man. This was first started as like a creepy narrative written on the internet in like 2010. In 2014, two 12-year-old girls in Wisconsin took their young friend into the woods with them and stabbed her 19 times. And they told authorities and everyone else that the Slender Man instructed them to do it, and they were doing this to appease the Slender Man. So this is, an example of a folie à deux. I don't speak French. Did I do that right? I don't know. So here's a thing in Newsweek to sort of describing the phenomena, because after this occurred, Slender Man, which was a relatively unknown internet meme, or not even meme, just story, reached memehood, reached viral status. And this quote says, "The response to what these girls are accused of doing reflects our deepest anxieties about girlhood, technology, and the growing gulf between parents and their children." And that's why this kind of news story rivets us. We say to ourselves, how awful, while yearning for more. And I thought that was an interesting quote. And this sort of describes how the Slender Man is a moral panic. It's a thing that sort of comes out of nowhere, but actually speaks to our deepest fears. And I would add that those deepest fears, to tie this back, are things that are abject, things that we don't really talk about. They sort of hold up the structure of our society, but they're there. So some conclusions. Try to make a point out of all of this. Creating narratives is a ubiquitous fact of human life, and the best stories, the stories that stick with us, teach us something. Fear is a pervasive and evolutionarily highly conserved emotion that functions as a guide for survival, but can also control us. By paying attention to what we fear, and by naming those fears, even when or if they exist as abject and as a sort of unclean taboo, we can potentially grow both as conscious individuals and a conscious society. And I'm going to end here with a quote from my favorite book, Dune. And this is the Bene Gesserit Litany Against Fear. It says, "I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain." And again, this sort of ties into, or I hope encompasses a lot of the lecture, which are grand rounds, which is to say that when we look at our fears and confront them and accept them, we are able to integrate them as part of ourselves and I want to say move on, but just accept things as they are. And hopefully, ideally, this can help us to grow. So, special thanks to my family and friends. It's me with my parents here. I'm going to go through some more pictures. Boop, boop, boop. That's me and my sister. We used to watch the X-Files together growing up. It doesn't look like it, but she's 10 years older than me, so I'd be really scared, and she would not be. Then this is me with my brother. This is me with some of my closest friends. I couldn't have made it this far without these people, all of these people. This is me with my wonderful partner, Parth. Stuing, she's in the audience. I was hoping, is Parth here? He's so funny. Anyways, then I want to thank the residents. I couldn't have made it through these 4 years without all of you. Special thanks to Dr. Goodwin, my current supervisor. He's given me extremely helpful tips and tricks for psychiatry and therapy. My previous supervisors, Dr. Shanebackler and Dr. Campbell. Dr. Shanebackler did a really great job of teaching me that even a neurologist can be interested in psychodynamics. So that was pretty cool. I want to thank the training office, Dr. Caudell, Dr. Reese, and Christy. She might as well be a doctor here. Again, the fellow residents and all the other faculty here, you all have taught me something valuable, each and every one of you, in one way or another. So here are my references and questions. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That type. Hmm. I think it's my favorite because it is so much like a fairy tale, and it does sort of tell this story that um, could be repeated, could be sort of generalized to any sort of scenario. It's just an instance of the Babadook, and I don't think they're going to make any sequels, but it could be a whole series of people, overcoming their trauma in one way or another, and that might be interesting. So I think the psychological relevance of that one really stuck with me. There's also a lot of other good ones out there. Hmm. That which thing in particular, that the monster becomes less scary, or that they say it's still out there? Well, I think that the fact that it's still out there sort of says that the movie, and most of the stories we tell sort of are microcosms of our own lives. So just because one person got rid of this monster or one group of people got rid of this monster, whatever it represents is still a thing and should still be treated as a thing. And it's probably why Ridley Scott wanted to keep the alien alive at the end, to sort of show the conflict is still there. It's not actually resolved. Ali? Yeah, I remember talking with you about that. I'm not really sure. I didn't come across anything specifically, but I think that those tropes, as they sort of do represent something that is abject, like I said, the vampire is a body without a soul. So inherently, whatever that means can symbolize a ton of different things. And so I think as the symbol becomes more relevant to whatever society is going through at that time, it probably adapts. Yeah, and that's interesting. I mean, I think you could, I think with this stuff here, if I really would have liked, it could have been great to have like a whole series of lectures on this. There's just so much out there. I don't want to do that, but there's just there's just so much out there. So I really had to sort of narrow down my focus and to try to cover the sort of breadth of things I want to talk about. Which is actually still abject in that way, because that's, if it is a lifestyle choice, what is that talking about with LGBTQ? Like, could it have something to do with that? Could it have something to do with kids wanting to be more individualized and sort of promoting that? So that is still a thing that's occurring in our culture and sort of disrupts the social order. So it's abject in a new way. Yeah. Hmm. Right. No, I agree. I mean, I think as we have these movies where the people are able to put a lot more planning and structure into them, you're going to get a lot more, maybe contrived symbolism. But I do think there's something innate because of how fear affects our behavior and because we need to survive in telling stories. Um, and I think, there is sort of a collective experience that, and a collective and we all share the same genes, so there's probably a proclivity for creating stories like this. And actually, just as an example, although this is still relatively recent, Psycho, was going to talk about briefly, but I cut it out, is an excellent example of an Oedipal complex. If everyone here is familiar with Psycho, the Bates Motel, Norman Bates lives there, his mom lives there with him, and anytime a cute young woman comes there, he dresses up as the mom and kills her. So it's threat, and also the mom's really dead. So he has this unhealthy relationship with his dead mother that is stopping him from advancing. So what's interesting there is Hitchcock actually was shocked that Psycho was so successful and sort of implied that he did not mean to insert the Oedipal nature into that story. So, and I'm not, really trying to promote Freud here, but I think it's a chicken or egg sort of thing, and it kind of begs that question as well, even though it's also a more recent story. Does that make sense? Okay. Johnny? Well, I think this is relevant. First of all, I'm not going to tell them to go watch a horror movie. I know you told me that on the phone the other day. I was like, don't ask that question, Johnny. But I think, but thank you for the question. But I think um, it's important to help someone construct a narrative where there is something that is symbolic occurring, whether or not they're aware of the symbolism or not. And so maybe being familiar with these narratives could be helpful in helping people sort of construct, knowing what's out there in the collective unconscious could give you sort of leads in therapy. Cool. Thank you.